They thought it was just land on a map. Paperwork buried, boundaries blurred, authority assumed. One quiet decision turned my private property into a construction zone, and before I could stop it, dozens of homes rose where water had always been meant to rest. Letters arrived. Fines followed. Power was flexed by people who believed they were untouchable. What they didn't know was that the ground they built on held a silent force, patiently waiting. When the last warning was ignored, I stopped asking for permission and started following the law instead. And when the gates finally opened, everything changed. The question is, who was really in control when the water began to move? Before everything unraveled, life in that community moved at the speed of routine. The days followed predictable rhythms shaped by seasons, weather, and the quiet satisfaction of ownership. The land had been in my care for years, long before the neighborhood association ever had a name or letterhead. It wasn't flashy property. It wasn't fenced off or manicured for show. It was functional, inherited responsibility layered with history, permits, surveys, and long-forgotten easements that most people never bothered to read. The property sat slightly apart from the newer homes, sloping downward toward a natural basin that filled during heavy rains. That basin wasn't decorative. It existed for a reason tied to drainage, flood control, and infrastructure decisions made decades earlier. The dam wasn't dramatic either. It was regulated, inspected, and legally recognized. It existed quietly, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Most of the time, no one noticed it at all. When the development expanded, the change felt gradual at first. More trucks. More stakes in the ground. More paperwork posted on shared bulletin boards. The HOA formed as these things always do, with promises of order, property values, and community standards. Committees were created. Rules were drafted. Authority slowly consolidated into binders and email lists. None of it seemed threatening. It looked administrative, even helpful. At the beginning, interactions were limited to newsletters and seasonal reminders. Lawn heights. Parking guidelines. Approved paint colors. Minor things that people shrugged off because it felt easier than pushing back. The association presented itself as professional and organized, with consultants and engineers referenced casually, as if expertise alone made decisions unquestionable. Construction began in phases. Foundations appeared where open ground used to stretch. Streets were extended. Drainage channels were redirected. Every change was explained away as progress. The map circulated by the HOA showed clean lines and confident boundaries. The problem was that those lines didn't match reality. The land I owned didn't draw attention because it didn't look like ownership to people who only understood property through fences and houses. It blended in. That made it easy to ignore. Easy to assume. Easy to reinterpret when expansion demanded more space than was originally approved. At first, the signs were subtle. Equipment parked where it hadn't before. Survey markers placed too close to familiar landmarks. Construction runoff behaving differently after storms. None of it was enough on its own to cause alarm, but together it formed a pattern that felt off. Records were checked. Old permits were pulled. The details didn't line up with what was happening on the ground. The HOA continued forward with confidence. Plans were approved internally. Meetings were held without outside input. The tone shifted from cooperative to declarative. Notices began to arrive referencing compliance, access, and usage. The language was polished but firm, suggesting authority rather than discussion. The dam, long ignored, suddenly became a footnote in their documents. Something categorized as obsolete or non-essential. A feature they believed could be managed, rerouted, or absorbed into their design without consequence. The land surrounding it was treated as flexible, as if history and law could be overwritten by newer blueprints. Life at home became less quiet. Paperwork piled up. Certified letters replaced newsletters. Inspections were referenced but never clearly explained. Responsibility was implied without acknowledgement of ownership. Each step forward by the HOA felt like another inch taken without permission. Still, there was restraint. The assumption that someone would eventually notice the discrepancy and correct it. That logic tends to hold until it doesn't. Construction doesn't pause for uncertainty, and authority rarely questions itself once momentum builds. By the time the full scope became clear, foundations were set. Roads were paved. Homes were rising in neat rows on land that had never been offered, sold, or surrendered. What had once been background infrastructure was now central to a growing dispute no one wanted to address directly. And underneath it all, beneath concrete and confidence, the water remained patient, contained only because the law said it should be. As the neighborhood continued to grow, the pressure stopped feeling accidental and started feeling deliberate. What had once been quiet assumptions hardened into written notices, stamped envelopes, and formal language designed to sound unquestionable. The HOA no longer acted like a group managing shared interests. It acted like an authority correcting a mistake that, in its mind, should never have existed. The first real escalation came disguised as procedure. Requests for access to the land arrived, framed as routine inspections tied to community safety. The language avoided ownership entirely. It spoke of oversight, cooperation, and compliance, as if the land were already theirs and permission was merely a courtesy. When access wasn't granted immediately, the tone shifted. Follow-up notices referenced delays, obstruction, and potential penalties for interfering with approved development plans. Fines appeared next. Not for damage or violations that had actually occurred, but for failure to respond within arbitrary timelines. Numbers were attached to deadlines that felt intentionally confusing. The amounts weren't devastating on their own, but they stacked quickly, each one framed as evidence of non-cooperation. Construction activity intensified around the property. Heavy equipment moved closer. Temporary fencing crept inward. Drainage paths were altered without notice, changing how water flowed during storms. Attempts to clarify ownership were met with redirection rather than answers. Committees deferred responsibility to consultants. Consultants deferred to approvals. Approvals referenced plans that didn't reflect recorded boundaries. The pressure wasn't just administrative anymore. It became personal. Vehicles lingered near the property. Photos were taken. Measurements were recorded without explanation. Storms began to change the tone of everything. Water levels rose faster than before. Runoff behaved unpredictably. Each storm was a reminder of what the land was built to do. The realization settled slowly but firmly: the HOA had constructed an entire community on a system it didn't control. By the time the confrontation arrived, it no longer looked like a disagreement. The final notice arrived with a tone that left no room for misinterpretation. It wasn't a request anymore. It was an order. What the HOA didn't realize was that their demand triggered the very mechanism they had spent months dismissing. Seasonal rains arrived heavier than forecasted. The dam responded exactly as it was designed to. Sensors registered thresholds. Protocols activated. When the gates were opened, it wasn't out of spite or revenge. It was compliance. Streets flooded first. Yards saturated. Foundations designed for dry ground met conditions they had never been engineered to withstand. The narrative collapsed in hours. The illusion of control evaporated. The land hadn't changed. The law hadn't changed. Only the certainty had. In the aftermath, the neighborhood didn't snap back to normal. Construction permits were suspended. Work crews vanished. Oversight arrived with real authority. The association's influence weakened fast. Responsibility fragmented. Momentum turned against them. Residents asked questions. Trust eroded. Financial consequences followed. The dam returned to its quiet role, no longer invisible. The land remained. The water remained. The rules remained unchanged. What disappeared was the belief that authority could be asserted without consequence. You can build over reality for a while, but eventually, it asserts itself.